Welcome to Warland's Archive channel.
When the Union cracked.
1861, America begins to split. In holes like this, Southern leaders break away, forming a new nation. The stage is set for a war that will tear the country apart. The war within. Cannons roar as smoke fills the air. This isn't just a battle, it's a nation at war with itself. Brothers fighting brothers, cities burning, and the soul of America on the line. The price of division, and over 600,000 Americans will lose their lives, not just soldiers on distant battlefields, but sons, fathers, and brothers torn from families. The nation bleeds. The bloodshed would reach every corner of the nation, making the Civil War the deadliest conflict in U.S. history. The nation's reckoning. This is a story of the American Civil War, a war fought not just with rifles and cannons, but with ideas about freedom, power, and the soul of a nation. What caused the Civil War? The main cause of the Civil War was one explosive issue: slavery. It wasn't just a political debate, it was a deeply entrenched system that treated human beings as property. Fuel of the South. The southern states depended on slavery to fuel their agricultural economy, especially on vast cotton plantations, where enslaved African Americans were forced to labor from dawn to dusk under brutal conditions, generating immense wealth for white landowners while receiving nothing in return. Turning tide. In the North, slavery was fading and seen as a moral stain, more than chains. Slavery may have started the conflict, but it was power, politics, and deep divisions in leadership that kept the fire of war burning long after. Power or freedom. The southern states believed they should be free to make their own laws, even if that meant allowing slavery to continue, no matter what the federal government said. Divided by dollars. The North was becoming a hub of factories, railroads, and fast-growing cities, focused on industry and innovation. Meanwhile, the South relied on farming, especially cotton, which depended heavily on slave labor. These two economies clashed in their values and visions for America's future. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president, and while he didn't call for an immediate end to slavery, he strongly opposed letting it expand into new U.S. territories. That was enough to terrify Southern leaders. They saw it as a direct threat to their economy, their power, and their way of life. Born in rebellion, fearing they'd lose control, 11 southern states decided to break away from the United States and form a new nation, the Confederate States of America. The war begins. The first shot of the Civil War rang out on April 12, 1861. Confederate forces opened fire on Fort Sumter, a Union-held fort in South Carolina. What began as a single attack quickly spiraled into a full-scale war that would divide the nation for 4 long, bloody years. 2 leaders, one divided nation. During the Civil War, the United States split in 2. The Union in the North was led by President Abraham Lincoln, who wanted to keep the country together. The South, calling itself a Confederacy, chose Jefferson Davis as its president, fighting to break away and protect their way of life, including slavery. The war no one saw coming. Both sides thought the war would be over in a few months. They were wrong, very wrong. Over the next 4 years, the country was torn apart by battles, blockades, sieges, and bloodshed. Major battles and turning points. Now, let's take a closer look at some of the key battles that shaped the Civil War. Battle of Bull Run, 1861. The Battle of Bull Run in 1861 was the first major fight of the Civil War. It proved to the North that this wouldn't be a quick or easy war. It would be long and brutal. Battle of Antietam, 1862. Antietam was the bloodiest single day in American history. Over 22,000 soldiers killed, wounded, or missing in just 24 hours of brutal combat. Battle of Gettysburg, 1863. The turning point. The Union stopped the Confederate invasion of the North. Over 50,000 men died or were wounded in 3 days. Siege of Vicksburg, 1863. The Union's victory at Vicksburg gave them full control of the Mississippi River, cutting the Confederacy in half and crippling their supply lines. Freedom in the fire. Mid-war, Lincoln dropped a bombshell, the Emancipation Proclamation. It wasn't just a document. It was a moral stand that redefined the war's purpose. The fight was no longer just about preserving the Union. It was now about ending slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation. In January 1863, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. It was a turning point, shifting the war's purpose from saving the Union to ending slavery. A nation redefined. It declared that all enslaved people in the Confederate-controlled areas were now free, at least on paper. A war transformed. It didn't immediately free everyone, but the Emancipation Proclamation completely changed the war's meaning. A new mission. At first, the Union had been fighting to keep the nation together, but now it was fighting for something bigger, for the freedom of millions. The proclamation made slavery the central issue of the war, turning it into a moral fight. Black soldiers joined the fight. It also opened the door for African Americans to enlist in the Union Army. Over 180,000 black men stepped forward, risking their lives to fight for freedom, dignity, and a future they could call their own. They weren't just soldiers, they were symbols of a new America, rising from the ashes of divided one. The end of the war. By 1865, the South was exhausted, completely drained by 4 brutal years of war. Once thriving cities now lay in ruins, their buildings charred, streets deserted, and communities shattered. The South weakens. Supply lines were broken, food and ammunition grew scarce, and desperation set in. Confederate soldiers were outnumbered and overwhelmed, deserting, surrendering, or dying in battle. The once defiant Southern resistance was collapsing under the weight of destruction, hunger, and hopelessness. The war ends. On April 9, 1865, at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia, the long and bloody war came to a dramatic end. Victory at last. Confederate General Robert E. Lee, realizing the South could fight no longer, surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant. With that historic handshake, 4 years of devastation, death, and division finally came to a close. The Civil War was over, but the healing had just begun. A nation mourns. Just 5 days after the war's end, tragedy struck. On April 14, 1865, President Abraham Lincoln was shot while attending a play at Ford Theater. The man who had led the Union through its darkest days was taken from the nation at the very moment of its fragile victory, a heartbreaking end to a war that had already cost so much. Aftermath and impact. The Civil War left a deep and painful scar on the soul of America. It wasn't just a war of armies. It was a war that tore through families, communities, and the very foundation of the country. The cost of war. Over 620,000 people lost their lives, more than in any other conflict in American history. Brothers fought against brothers, fathers against sons. Entire towns lost generations of young men. The cost of war wasn't just counted in lives, but in devastation. Farmlands were burned, cities reduced to rubble, and the Southern economy was left in collapse. For years, the nation struggled to recover, not only physically, but emotionally. A new dawn. And yet, out of this immense suffering came a turning point. In 1865, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution was passed. It did what the war had fought toward. It abolished slavery in the United States, making it illegal in every state, for every person. Aftermath. But the end of the Civil War didn't mean the end of struggle. The country was still deeply divided. Racism persisted, poverty spread across both North and South, and rebuilding the war-torn South became a long, painful process called Reconstruction. The long struggle. Though slavery was officially abolished, African Americans continued to face violence, segregation, and injustice for generations to come. Legacy. The American Civil War was more than just a conflict between North and South. It was a war for the very future of a nation, a test of whether the United States could survive its own contradictions. The big questions: would it remain forever divided, or could it reunite as one country, with liberty and justice not just as ideals, but as promises kept? The outcome: when the smoke cleared and the fighting stopped, the Union stood victorious. Slavery was abolished. The 13th Amendment marked a turning point in American history. The cost of justice. But that victory came at a steep cost. Over 620,000 lives lost, families shattered, cities reduced to ashes. More than war. And yet, what the war truly revealed was this: democracy is fragile. It can be torn apart by hate, fear, and power, but it can also be rebuilt by courage, unity, and sacrifice. Defining America. The Civil War wasn't just about generals and soldiers. It was about the soul of a nation, a defining struggle to answer the question, what does America stand for? And to this day, we are still answering it.